We talk about these massive, huge companies, but there's a room full of people at all of those companies going,
what do we take up?
What do we build next?
Yeah.
Which direction do we take?
But also they're making that decision
4 years ahead, 5 years ahead.
Yeah.
So they've got a long lead
longer.
time.
Yeah.
And what I think we've seen with the Africa Twin is they've seen that switch and they've done what they can with the bike they've got.
Yeah.
You know, they've to make the Africa Twin weigh 200 kilos isn't a bolt-on job for a manufacturer.
It's a redesign.
It needs to start from the beginning again with a different set of goalposts in mind. And when you've spent a lot of money developing a frame and engine package that you're expecting to last 5 years, a decade, suddenly you're in a difficult position to try and you've aimed at that market and the market's skewed left.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one reason why bikes are way heavier than you think they ought to be in a class.
Yeah.
Because it takes a lot of time to react to that.
Mm-hmm.
Second reason, every manufacturer sets their own design standards for a lot of things across their motorcycles. So they'll say, pick one out of the blue. I'm not allowed under oath and threatening of broken legs to reveal any actual ones from Triumph because it's something that actually on the day I left, one of the design bosses pulled me into the office and said, if you tell any of our secrets, we'll break your legs, which he was half joking, I think.
Okay, so...
if you're watching, AD, hi.
Yeah, okay, so I don't know. You'd say something like, why does a manufacturer make... Okay, a really good example, F800, F850 GS, really soft forks. Why?
We've had this conversation.
We have had this
1,000
conversation.
times. So, yeah, it could just be something as simple as somewhere in the BMW design and adventure bike or designer dual purpose touring bike manual is a test that says you have to be able to do 60 mile an hour and jam on the front brake and not lock the wheel. And you know the tests are all really specific to each manufacturer, but if they've got a test that the bike has to pass, then they'll do whatever they need. So they might need to make a really soft fork so that the bike dives and gets that grip in that situation. It might be braking on an icy hill, so they need a really soft fork to get weight transfer under very light brake load.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know BMW's dirty secrets, but there's often things like that, and every manufacturer has a different one. It might be you've got to cross a gully, a creek crossing at 60 mile an hour with 150 kilo pillion and overloaded luggage. So your subframe needs to be stronger.
Yeah.
You know, and the point I'm making is every manufacturer have to develop these tests to prove off their next bike. If it then turns out that by meeting all those tests, you can never actually get a light bike to market, it takes a lot of momentum to change those tests.
Yeah, and so you kind of mentioning that, I read an article a few years ago, which was with someone that worked in Canada for Honda, and I can't remember what model of bike it was, but basically he was talking about why they never bought a certain model of bike to Canada, and essentially he said the problem Honda have got is that in their testing guidelines, to homologate a new model in a certain place, you have to do 1 million miles of collective testing on that continent. So if you want to bring a bike to North America, you have to ride X amount of miles on that bike in that environment to make sure it meets all the standards. You can't just take one from Japan and go, well, it works in Japan, so we're good.
Yeah.
Do you know? Whereas maybe other manufacturers don't do it in the same way, and for better or worse, that's the limit on Honda. Do you know? But it would make sense with something like the Africa Twin, because if they decide what it's going to be 4 years ago, start building it, and then get through the testing phase, they still need to do, and I'm sure BMW are the same, like when the S1000 first came out, they were super proud of how many miles of testing they'd done. You know, they'd done 100,000 collective miles on, or something ridiculous.
More than that, yeah, more than that. But yeah,
you know, hundreds of thousands of miles between their test crew on those bikes to make sure that they're meeting the standards they need to meet, which then it starts to explain why that stuff is difficult, right?
It does. And yeah, and that's where you get that variation. So, you know, it might well be that if you found out all of the manufacturer's testing constraints, and you took something from a manufacturer that maybe always makes a slightly too heavy bike, and then you put another manufacturer, their bikes through the same tests, they might fail those tests. Now that test might be, again, such a niche thing that in the real world no one's ever discovered that problem. But if you put yourself in the engineer's position, you've sat there, you've been designing bikes to pass this test for 20 years. Suddenly you're finding you need to save weight, and you can't save weight and pass that test and meet the budget requirements, blah, 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 blah. So you've got to change the test. Now you're now saying that I'm going to change this safety requirement, this longevity requirement test to make my bike lighter and then sell it out to the market. That's a terrifying thing to do.
Totally.
Because if you get it wrong,